the Jacksonian Era, 1828-1840. These are your core objectives, and just like any other chapters, you don't have to turn these in. These are just for your reference to make sure you understand these principles while you're reading the chapter. Jacksonian democracy. Oftentimes, Andrew Jackson is referred to as the president of the common man, and there's some argument for that. Because of his humble background growing up, he did come from very common roots, but as we discussed earlier, he was quite wealthy. He developed a very large, wealthy plantation in Tennessee, and he was a military general. He did try to stay connected to his roots in many ways. For example, after winning the presidency, he opened the White House up to the people for this huge reception. That's the only time it's ever happened, because the people acted horribly and they destroyed the furniture and tracked up the carpets, and it cost a lot of money to refurbish the White House after this. So that was the last time the common people were allowed to just willy-nilly go through the White House. But other people, when you look at Jackson's presidency, seeing our picture of him as a king, he was very autocratic, also true to his military roots. Remember, he was a general, so he was accustomed to people doing what he said with no questioning of his authority. And so while he is often referred to as the president of the common man, some people also felt that he was very autocratic, dictatorial, and maybe abused his power somewhat. One of the things that we do associate with the Jackson presidency is the spoils system. And when we refer to the spoils system in American politics and government, we're basically referring to this old adage of "to the victor belongs the spoils," meaning that you reward your political supporters with government jobs. Now, was Andrew Jackson the first president to do this? No, of course not. Was he the last? No, it's still quite often done today. Actually, it is the norm of the day. But what we see with Andrew Jackson is that he did it to a degree that no president prior to him or since him has done. Remember when we were discussing the election of 1828 and all the mudslinging and the attacks on his wife? Jackson, remember, was very bitter about that, and since Rachel, his wife, died soon after the election, he blamed her death on these attacks. He said she died of a broken heart, and he vowed to get even with all of his political enemies. So one of the things he did when he became president was he had a house cleaning. Everybody that had worked for the previous administration was fired, no matter how high or how low, no matter what their expertise was in the job, they were fired. And while we expect this in today's society with like cabinet positions and directorships and things of that nature, we don't expect people in lower level positions to be fired. And that's one thing that Andrew Jackson did do. He got rid of about 3/4 of the government officials during his administration. And the problem with that was that while some of those people did need to get to be fired, they were basically retired on the job, they hadn't really been doing their job for many years, he did not always replace them with very good people. Andrew Jackson, remember, is a political outsider, and so he wants to surround himself with people that he trusts. So he puts a lot of his old friends, his military buddies, his relatives, people that had supported him in the presidency, into these political positions, and many of them were not qualified for those jobs, and they could not do those jobs very well. And some of them were just outright crooks, just like the previous administration had. One really good example of this was Samuel Swartwout. Andrew Jackson was friends with Samuel Swartwout, and so he decided that he would make him the collector of the customs duties for the port of New York. Now, this is a very important position because this is the major port in the United States where goods are brought into the country, so a lot of money goes through that customs house. even though a lot of people had warned Andrew Jackson that Samuel was not maybe the most trustworthy of individuals, Jackson decided that he was going to appoint him anyway. And for several years, things rolled along just perfectly. But during Andrew Jackson's second administration, he will serve 2 terms, Samuel Swartwout will decide to go on a little vacation to Europe, and he doesn't return. And when they do an audit of his books, they find out that the New York Customs House is $1 million short. So Samuel Swartwout is famous in American history for being the first person that embezzled $1 million from the U.S. government. Like his predecessor, Andrew Jackson will also have to deal with a crisis with the tariff. The tariff of 1828, which Jackson's Democratic Party had passed while they were in Congress, continued to be a problem, especially in South Carolina and other southern states, because it was hurting their trade with Europe. Then in 1832, Congress passed another tariff that did reduce the tariff on some items, but it was not an overall reduction of the tariff. And many of the southern states, especially South Carolina, felt that they had been promised that the tariff would be reduced as a whole. And the cotton growers objected to these very high federal tariffs because it was hurting their trade, especially with Great Britain. So South Carolina, which had led the protest in 1828, is going to lead the protest again. John C. Calhoun, who we talked about in Chapter 9, is going to bring back that South Carolina exposition in which he calls for the states to nullify the tariff of 1828 and the tariff of 1832. This time, South Carolina will go through with it. They will call a special session of their legislature, and they will pass a bill nullifying the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, which basically means that those tariffs will not be collected in the South Carolina ports. Charleston being a major port, this is going to be a big deal. What South Carolina was hoping was that other southern states would join with them, and this would give them more power and pressure on the federal government to get these 2 tariffs repealed. Unfortunately for South Carolina, but fortunately for the U.S. government, no other states joined. And so this is going to end up passing over and not causing a major federal crisis. But at the time, it looked like things might get really out of hand. When South Carolina nullified the bill, they're basically challenging the authority of the federal government. So Andrew Jackson will go to Congress and he will ask for approval to use military power against the states if necessary. And so Congress will pass the force bill, which will give him the authority to use military power to enforce the laws of the federal government. And after the force bill was passed, South Carolina and their nullification supporters backed down. This was good because it kind of put that states' rights nullification out of the picture for a short period of time. But remember, this is when we really are beginning to move toward this states' rights doctrine that's going to push us closer and closer to the Civil War. One of the other things that helped to bring the crisis to an end was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was still around in Congress, and Henry Clay proposed a reform of the tariff where every year the tariff would be reduced a little bit. Not a major reduction every year, but a little bit until the tariff went back to the rates that it was in 1816. This seemed to be a good compromise for both sides, the industrialists and the agriculturalists, and so the nullification crisis will end, but it's really just kind of on hold because we're going to see these challenges to federal authority continuing until we get to the Civil War. 1832 was a presidential election year, And in this election, the Republican Party, which opposed Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party, nominated Henry Clay as their candidate. But they were searching for a major issue that they could use to hopefully defeat Andrew Jackson on. And so one of the things that they decided to look at was rechartering the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States, as you recall, was very unpopular in the western states and in some of the southern states also. And Andrew Jackson was a native son of the West. And it was unpopular because of that panic of 1819, where they had called in a bunch of bank loans and caused economic crisis in the western states. Well, Andrew Jackson had always said that the bank was unconstitutional and it created a monopoly. And so he had always been opposed to it. The Republican Party decided that they would push through a recharter bill of the bank in an effort to bring the bank issue to the forefront and hopefully cause Andrew Jackson to lose support either in the East or the West. The bank actually was not due for recharter for 4 years, so they're pushing the bill through early in order to make it a political issue. Their goal was that if Andrew Jackson signed the bill, then he would feel betrayed by his Western supporters and they would probably not vote for him in the election. But then if he vetoed the bill, he would lose support in the East because the industrial parts of the country really supported the bill. So they were hoping that either way it would cause Andrew Jackson political problems. Well, the recharter bill was passed by the Republican-controlled Congress, and when it went to Andrew Jackson for signature, true to his values, he vetoed the bank. Now, that doesn't mean that the bank goes out of commission at this time, though, because it still had 4 years on its charter, but he will veto the bank. During the election, when the bank issue came up, Jackson could say, I stood by my values and I voted against the bank, and enough Westerners and Southerners voted for Andrew Jackson that he won re-election. Jackson felt that the bank issue and him winning the election on the bank issue was a mandate from the people that he should begin to dismantle the bank. He can't close it because it still has 4 years on its charter, but he can weaken the bank. So what Andrew Jackson began to do was he began to take the federal deposits out of the Bank of the United States. Well, if he takes the deposits out of the Bank of the United States, what does he do with them? You have to have some place to put the federal money. So he began putting them in private banks and state banks, what became known as pet banks by his critics. And the reason they were called pet banks and greatly criticized because these banks were not insured in any way. So if these banks went belly up, if they lost money, then the federal deposits would be lost. But he began to pull money out of the Bank of the United States, which weakened the Bank of the United States. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States, and so he was desperate to try to hold on to the bank, to keep it powerful, and he wanted to prove that the bank was necessary. So he began to call in loans, cease to give loans, hoping that it would bring about a financial crisis that would help people realize that the Bank of the United States actually was needed. Biddle ended up losing that effort to save the bank because Jackson just refused to see the financial problems that were being created by taking the money out of the federal bank and by Nicholas Biddle refusing to give new loans and calling in old loans. And a financial crisis did begin to emerge. But Andrew Jackson was determined that the Bank of the United States would go out of power, and it did in 1836 when its charter expired. But by 1836, it had virtually been destroyed anyway. Um, Andrew Jackson won the bank war. The Bank of the United States disappeared. But in the long run, he created an economic void in the country, because what we see from 1836, when the Bank of the United States officially ceases to exist, until the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, there is no way for the federal government to regulate the economy. So when we have depressions or recessions or financial crises, whatever you want to call them, there was no way for the federal government to intervene, to raise interest rates or lower interest rates, to get more money into circulation or take money out of circulation. So many people, especially economic historians, are very critical of Andrew Jackson's handling of the economy of the United States, because he did create this void with destroying the Bank of the United States. Probably one of the biggest things that we remember Andrew Jackson for, and it is not a noble thing, is his Indian removal policies. Andrew Jackson was an old Indian fighter from Tennessee, and he had long believed that the Native Americans were just in the way of America's advancement. And so his goal really was to move the Indians out of the way of the U.S. government and the U.S. citizens. And so during his administration in 1830, he went to Congress and asked Congress to pass the Indian Resettlement Act. The Indian Resettlement Act will move all of the eastern tribes, all of the Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River, to an area west of the Mississippi between the Red River and the Arkansas River. Basically what we consider Oklahoma today, a little bit bigger. It became eventually known as the Indian Territory. Now, some of the native tribes that were already very depleted in numbers moved to the new Indian Territory without any resistance. But some native tribes did resist. One of these was a tribe from Wisconsin, the Sauk and Fox Indians. They armed themselves and resisted removal from the U.S. government. Their fight became known as Black Hawk's War, because Chief Black Hawk was the leader of this group. Their fight lasted, maybe a year, but eventually the American military machine, because they have better weapons and they have more soldiers, was able to defeat the Sauk and Fox Indians, and they were moved west of the Mississippi River. Another group that resisted removal were the Seminole from Florida. The Seminoles fought for a long time, well into the 1840s, before they were finally defeated. And because they lasted so long, some of the Seminoles were allowed to stay in Florida just on reservations. But some Seminoles were moved to the Indian Territory. Another group of Indians or Native Americans that resisted removal were the Cherokee from Georgia. The Cherokee, if you recall, were one of our 5 civilized tribes that we talked about in Chapter 1. And they had always had a very good relationship with white society, and they had assimilated many of our customs. They had schools and constitution and newspaper. And unfortunately, some of the tribes had even adopted slavery, mimicking the white settlers in Georgia. But when the state of Georgia tried to get the Cherokee to sign these removal treaties and give up their land and move west of the Mississippi, the Cherokee, because they were more versed in American culture, refused. And the state of Georgia then passed a law saying that all the Cherokee laws and all treaties with the Cherokee were null and void. So the Cherokee decided to resist, but their resistance is going to be different. Instead of going to war physically, militarily with the U.S. government, they decide to use the court system. So they will file a case saying that their laws are being violated and their treaties are being violated. The case becomes known as Worcester versus Georgia, and it will eventually reach the U.S. Supreme Court. This is still during the time of the Marshall Court, and in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, Marshall's court will uphold this concept that we talked about earlier in Chapter 9 of the sanctity of contracts. They said that the Cherokee treaties were contracts, and contracts are sacred under U.S. law, and that you cannot change a contract without approval of all parties involved. And so in this ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Georgia law nullifying Cherokee treaties was unconstitutional. So the Cherokee actually won the Supreme Court case. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court does not have enforcement power. The Supreme Court looks to the federal government to enforce its rulings. But remember, it was Andrew Jackson, the president, who started this whole movement of Indian removal. And so Jackson refused to use federal authority to uphold the Supreme Court ruling. So the Cherokee were forcefully removed from Georgia. The Cherokee removal is one of the most tragic that we have records of, because it becomes known as the Trail of Tears, as the Cherokee were moved forcefully across land in this forced march from Georgia to Oklahoma. And along the way, many of the very old and the young will die, and hence the term the Trail of Tears. This map just shows us the Indian removals during this two-decade period from 1820 to 1840. The red lines are showing you where the native tribes are moved from, and you'll notice they're all moving into that area that we just talked about between the Arkansas and the Red Rivers that we're calling the Indian Territory. Later, this map is calling it Indian lands. For the next three presidents, instead of me giving you some brief discussion on them, I found some short videos that come from the History Channel's President series. And so there's three short videos, one on Martin Van Buren, one on William Henry Harrison, and one on John Tyler. And if you'll just click on these links, you can watch those videos. They're each, 5 minutes or shorter in length, and it'll give you an overview of those presidents. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these presidents because we're not going to have a lot of testing on these presidents. The last thing I want to talk about in this chapter, in this section, is what's sometimes referred to as the market revolution. We began kind of alluding to it a little bit in chapter 9, but as we move into the 1820s, we begin to have this expansion of the American economy that had been happening since the end of the War of 1812. We began having this economic expansion partially because of improvements in transportation. Remember in chapter 9 we talked about the National Road, or sometimes referred to as the Cumberland Road, that was built, that was financed by the U.S. government. Other roads will be built similar to the national roads, and we begin to see this network of what they called hard surface roads being created. Now, hard surface roads are similar more to what today we would consider like gravel roads, maybe very compact gravel roads. We're not looking at asphalt or concrete roads at this time, but it was better than what they had before, because what they had before was dirt roads. So when it rained, it just got muddy. Another thing that we see in transportation growing and developing is water transportation. The canal system really begins to expand during this time period. And the first canal that was created in the United States was the Erie Canal. This is actually a state project rather than a federal project. The state of New York commissioned the building of the Erie Canal in 1817. The Erie Canal is going to join the Hudson River at Troy, New York, with Lake Erie at Buffalo, New York. And so what we're basically doing is we're joining the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. And the Erie Canal is going to be very important to the expansion of trade in New York. It makes New York the gateway to the West by joining the two regions of the West and the East together. The Erie Canal was so successful that we began to see other canals being built throughout the country. Canals are an effective mode of transportation because anytime you can use water rather than land, you're going to have faster, cheaper transportation where you can carry more goods than you can over land. But the problem is with canals, you have to have two bodies of water to create those canals. So they work in the areas where you have waterways that you can do that. But later, of course, we'll see that as we move further west and you're not going to have those waterways, they're going to have to develop other methods of transportation. But we'll talk about that and the expansion of the railroads a little later. The need for these improved transportations came about because of the growth of industry in America that we've been talking about for the last couple of chapters. And one of the things that was driving the industrial expansion in America was the development of interchangeable parts. Interchangeable parts just simply means that there is basically a pattern for these parts, and they can be made in mass quantities in factories rather than being handmade by an individual. So once you develop interchangeable parts, building things like rifles or other mechanical items can be done much more effectively, much more quickly, and much more cheaply than having an individual who has to craft a gun, one gun at a time in his house, or his blacksmith shop. So the interchangeable parts really helped to push forward American industry during this new market period. The first big major industry in America was the textile industry, making cloth. And this was partially because we have these materials, mainly cotton, which we'll be getting from the southern states. And so the textile mills really began to develop, especially in the New England areas, but the textile mills are driven by southern cotton, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Once you have the expansion of industry, you need a workforce. And we've already talked about how slavery did not seem to work very well in the North. They had tried it, and in some areas you did see it, mostly in like the coastal regions, working on ports and things like that. But what really is going to provide the labor source for American industry in the North will be immigration. And we'll have a couple of big groups of immigrants that began moving into the United States in the late 1830s and 1840s. And of course, one of the biggest of these, actually the biggest of these, are the Irish. The Irish began moving to the United States. Really, they had been moving all along. But in the 1840s, we see this mass wave of Irish immigration because of the potato famine. Potatoes was the major crop in Ireland, and they began in the 1840s. They were hit with this blight, this black blight that just rotted the potatoes before they could mature and be harvested. And so a lot of the Irish were starving and losing money, and they couldn't make a living, and so they began moving to the United States. Another reason that the Irish moved to America that sometimes we don't talk about is because of the harsh treatment of the Irish by the English. The English did not allow Irish Catholics to own land. They could only work as tenant farmers, basically almost like a serf in Europe. They were persecuted for their religion. They had very limited political powers. And so the Irish saw America as a beacon of hope, a beacon of economic hope, but also of political and religious hope, where they would have equality and the right to practice their religion. Another group that came to America during this time period were the Germans. Many of these Germans are your Protestant Germans that are coming to America from the Catholic regions of the German states, and they become very hard workers that move into the northern regions and then spread more into kind of what today we would kind of consider the upper Midwest. Because of the massive waves of immigrants that began coming in the 1830s and 1840s, we began to see a kind of unfortunate development in America, this thing called nativism. Nativism is a negative because in this sense, in the 1830s and 1840s, it was really an anti-immigrant movement. They really did not like the immigrants coming to America, especially the Catholic immigrants that were coming from Ireland. They feel that these people are not equal to them. They feel that they are not going to assimilate well into American culture. And so a lot of this nativism was built on anti-Catholic, anti-religious prejudice. The Irish are going to experience a great deal of bigotry when they come to America. They're not accepted with open arms. Even though they speak English, they have a very strong accent. Many of them, most of them, are very poor when they come to America, and then they practice this Catholic religion. And there was a great deal of anti-Catholicism still in America, going all the way back to the colonial times, and really going all the way up until the 1960s, when John F. Kennedy is finally elected president and we finally get our first Catholic president of the United States. This nativism became so rampant in America that we even see a political party that emerges during this time period, known as the Know Nothing Party, that is an anti-immigrant party, but especially an anti-Catholic immigrant party. Of course, one of the driving forces of this new market economy was the raw material of cotton. Cotton became so widely grown throughout the southern states that it became known as king cotton. It was their primary crop. In many states, it was their only crop. It drove the entire southern economy. And what really helped cotton begin to grow and develop was in the late 1700s, around 1791, 1792, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Prior to the invention of the cotton gin, cotton was too expensive really to grow in mass quantities because it took a great deal of slave labor to pick the cotton and then separate the cotton fibers from the little seeds that were in it. But once Whitney invented the cotton gin, the cotton can be mechanically combed, and they separate the fibers from these little seeds. And so then the majority of the slave labor is used just to pick cotton, and they can produce thousands of pounds of cotton a day once the cotton gin is developed. Cotton is the major crop in all of what we consider the deep South. Still in the upper South, we see a little more of the tobacco, and the upper South would be like Maryland and Virginia. They do grow some cotton, but they are still growing tobacco. But in the regions of like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, those areas are going to be very heavily cotton states. And cotton was a driving force not just in the South, but in the American economy. As I mentioned earlier, it was this southern cotton that fueled the textile mills in the Northeast. We sold a great deal of cotton to Europe, especially to Great Britain. So it was a major economic factor in the United States, and that's what gave the South its political power up until the Civil War, was that they actually had the major crop in the country, which was cotton. Well, this concludes our Chapter 10 discussion. Our next chapter that we will be covering will be Chapter 13, and so we'll see you then.